We heard in that first reading from the Acts of the Apostles about a strong driving wind. Hopefully we're experiencing that now with, I just went back and looked and the thermostats had not been properly set. So hopefully we're going to get a taste of the healing of the Holy Spirit. Today's Feast of Pentecost rounds off the mysteries that we have been commemorating since Holy Week. We've been commemorating the life, the death, and the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. And it culminates with this strong driving wind, as Luke tells us in Acts, that the gathered church, the people of God, experienced for the first time as they experienced God's Holy Spirit in a new and unsurpassable way. And today we commemorate, all these thousands of years later, still commemorate this one reality about God's involvement in our human condition, in our human state. It's what we call the mystery of Christ. We are an incarnational people. Big word, but it means that God became one of us in the person of Jesus. And today's Feast of Pentecost teaches us that this ultimate reality of God's involvement with us in our human condition is an ongoing reality, not something that just happened 2,000 some odd years ago, but something that happens all the time within us and all around us. Pentecost was and still is a Jewish festival that celebrated 50 days after, in Jesus' day, it commemorated God's revelation of the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. But we celebrate Pentecost 50 days after Easter, and we celebrate breath, the breath of God, inspiring the first Christian community. Imagine that they inhale the Holy Spirit, as it were, just as you and I are called to inhale the Holy Spirit today. And today we hear two different versions of God's Spirit, of that gift. In John's Gospel, we find the disciples huddled in fear behind locked doors. And many times that's us too. And then Jesus comes among them and utters those words that are so common in Jesus' mouth in the New Testament. Shalom. Shalom. Peace be with you. And as they received that peace, which hopefully we will receive this day, their fears dissipated. But Jesus was not done with them yet. Because what did he do after they rejoiced and they saw his hands and his side? What did he do? He said again, Shalom. There's another part to that peace. And that other part is mission. He sent those disciples on mission just as he sends you and me on mission. At the end of Mass, it's the deacon's role to dismiss the people. Go in peace. Go on mission to be the risen Christ. And how will we do this? What does this look like? Jesus' instruction is pretty clear at the end of the gospel. He says, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain, they're retained. Now, the church has used these words most often, primarily in connection with the sacrament of reconciliation, and rightfully so. But the meaning of these words goes beyond that. They're much broader and deeper, because Jesus himself calls each of us to be agents of reconciliation, to be disciples of reconciliation. And many times we don't think of ourselves in that sense, because our words and our actions sometimes reveal that we are agents or disciples of our own pride and selfishness and ambition. Sometimes we're disciples of division and argumentation, and yes, sometimes of silence. And Jesus reminds us that we all have one common Father. Every person who has ever lived on this earth has one common Father, and that the gift of God's Spirit provides us with a freedom, and I hope we can experience that freedom to allow the healing of our wounds and the healing of the wounds that people have inflicted upon us. The gift of the Spirit enables us to ask for forgiveness from those whom we have wounded, and really to bridge whatever gaps and divisions that exist within our church, and they're certainly there, within our families, and even within ourselves. And yet, for some of us, that can be really difficult. It can be very difficult to receive God's Spirit because we've convinced ourselves that we know best. I can do it by myself. We are convinced that we want to stay in our comfort zone, that we've closed our minds to anything that challenges us in our comfort zone. And Jesus' promise to bestow his Spirit upon us can be limited in one way: by our unwillingness to receive the gift of God's Spirit. And when you think of that, we are able to block the gift of God's Spirit. And Jesus says to us, I'm with you always. Don't do that. Just honor one another, forgive one another. So how might we catch that wind of the Spirit that we heard about in the Acts of the Apostles? And I'd like you to consider these images in this story. If you were to go out on the water, you'd have two types of boats that you could use. You could use a power boat or a sailboat. And in a power boat, you got a lot of control. We start the engine, we head off on a straight line toward our destination, and we get there pretty quickly. Or we could get into a sailboat in which we don't have total control, but rather we've got to figure out which way the wind is blowing and how strong that wind is. And we've got to set our sails to catch that wind. And we probably won't be able to head in a straight direction because we're going to have to zigzag along our route to our destination. And the speed at which we move will be largely determined by the strength and the direction of the wind. And although there's much about a speedboat that's very attractive to us, living a life that is attuned to the Spirit is much more like being in that sailboat. May you and I allow the Spirit to fill our sails and to navigate us along the waves of life that continue to crash upon us. May we zigzag toward our destination, even though we might not understand exactly how we're going to do that. Which boat would you and I like to sail in?